The imperial nursery of Valfura Prime had forgotten the sound of laughter. 4-3 standard cycles. The grand chamber at the heart of the shimmering citadel had known only machine hum, hushed arguments, and the brittle silence of people too powerful to admit they were afraid. On a dais of living crystal lay the future of an empire. 3 tiny figures swaddled in woven starlight, skin faintly iridescent, bioluminescent veins dim and flickering. The triplets, heirs to the Valfuran throne. And they were dying. Rows of medrones hovered over them, injecting, scanning, recalibrating. Holographic readouts floated in the air, full of pulsing symbols and falling lines. To the court physicians, those lines meant failing organs, collapsing neural nets, a genetic cascade they could not halt. To the human janitor standing unnoticed in the corner, those lines meant something else entirely. David Reeves tightened his grip on the cleaning wand as another alarm chimed, higher and more frantic this time. The wand quivered faintly in his hand, a thin rod tipped with nanofiber that could scrub corrosive alien residues from crystal floors. It was rated to withstand acids, plasma scoring, and the occasional careless kick from an 8-legged diplomat. It was not rated for what David wanted to do with it. Hurl it straight through the nearest status display. He didn't, of course. You didn't survive 3 months cleaning the imperial palace of Valfura Prime by throwing things. Instead, David did what he always did when the grief crawled too high up his throat. He stared at the smudge on his glove. The glove was standard palace issue, self-sealing, mildly antiseptic, colored a muted silver. On the back of his hand, just below the knuckles, a faded line of purple glitter refused to wash out no matter what the nanosoap promised. His daughter had insisted on decorating the gloves before he left Earth. "So the aliens know you're friendly," she'd said, tongue poking out in concentration as she dragged the glitter pen across synthetic fabric. His chest tightened. The memory clipped the breath right out of him. Maya had been gone for 2 years. The smudge was still here. Another alarm shrieked. One of the triplets gave a weak, flickering cry, more a broken chirp than a sound. The palace physicians reacted instantly, scales flaring in anxious colors, hands flying over hollow panels. Neural flux at 30%. Autoimmune cascade escalating. Increased nanite density. Begin protocol C to red. David watched them prepare another treatment, another infusion of glowing fluid threaded with silver. The child's tiny limbs tensed as the injector descended. He knew that tension. He had watched it 1,000 times on a different world, beside a different bed. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications bell. This quiet human janitor is about to do something that will shock an entire empire. You will not want to miss how far this simple act of courage goes. Valfura Prime was a marvel on the outside. Kilometer-high spires of singing crystal, hoverways braided in the air, skyships tracing auroras through the upper atmosphere. To human visitors it looked like a postcard from the future. On the inside, David thought, it looked a lot like any overstressed government complex. Peeling seals on service doors, half-finished repairs, staff who stepped around problems because their job description said, "Not my concern." He had been hired as sanitation technician, human cultural liaison tier 3, which he'd quickly learned translated to, "You may clean up after everyone, and once a month someone will ask your opinion on whether humans prefer square or round snack trays." He was not a doctor. He wasn't a scientist, a diplomat, or a hero. He was a former construction worker from Ohio who had spent 3 brutal years living in pediatric wards, watching machines fail his child in slow motion. He had become good at mopping floors and bad at pretending that was enough. From his corner, David studied the triplets through the transparent containment field. They were exquisite in that unsettling Valfuran way, skin a translucent pearl, faint patterns of light traveling their veins in waves, eyelids edged with tiny bioluminescent filaments. Each had a slightly different hue to their glow, one blue-white, one green-gold, one soft violet. They should have been growing, babbling, getting into extremely expensive trouble. Instead they lay unnaturally still, thin chests hitching. The Empress Zyrene stood at the far end of the chamber, flanked by a semicircle of advisors. David had only seen her twice before at a distance, during ceremonial events when the cleaning staff hid behind decorative screens pretending to polish things that were already clean. Up close she was almost painfully composed. Tall, draped in flowing material that shifted through iridescent shades, crest of bioluminescent tendrils fanned behind her head in a halo. Her eyes, multifaceted and reflective, gave away nothing. Her hands were clasped tightly inside her sleeves. David had read a briefing packet about Valfuran rulers on the transport over. Physical contact between an empress and her heirs, it had said, was strictly controlled in early life. The royal line carried a psychic attunement that could overload if bonded too strongly, too quickly. So the heirs were raised by specialized attendants, bonded through ritualized viewings and designated touch intervals. As a father, the phrase touch interval had made something in David go cold. On the display nearest him, stress markers climbed with every new treatment. Cortisol analogs, adrenal spikes, neural overdrive. He didn't read Valfurin's script fluently, but the patterns were unervingly universal. These kids weren't just sick. They were terrified. He found his gaze returning to the Empress's locked hands. He wondered, absurdly, if anyone had ever given her permission to simply pick up her own children. The chief physician, a tall Valfurin whose crest shimmered in exhausted orange, turned to Zyrene. "My Empress," he said, voice trembling, "we have exhausted every protocol. Gene splicing, targeted nanotherapy, regenerative cocooning. Their cells do not respond. Their neural webs reject every correction." His voice faltered. Zyrene didn't move. "You are telling me," she said quietly, "that the line of Valfura ends here." "Not immediately," the physician tried. "But their life expectancy if they stabilize at all." Advisors shifted. Colors flashed through the chamber: anxiety, anger, calculation. Someone muttered about succession law. Someone else about keeping the crisis contained before the outer clan scented weakness. David, running the cleaning wand along the already spotless base of a console, thought, not for the first time, that for beings who claimed to sense emotional currents through color and scent, they were spectacularly bad at noticing when a room stank of despair. Another treatment cycled in. Another pain twitch from a tiny hand. Something in him snapped. "Stop," he said. It came out soft, reflexive. No one heard. The injector descended. "Stop." This time it was louder, edged with the steel he used to save for arguing with insurance companies at 3 a.m. Heads turned, annoyed at the interruption. The chief physician blinked at him, as if only just now realizing that the human with the mop was, in fact, a sentient being. "This is a sterile environment," the physician said, crest flushing in irritation. "You were instructed to stay invisible." "Yeah," David said. "Turns out I'm bad at that." He set the cleaning wand down very carefully. His heart hammered. Every rational part of his brain screamed that humans did not interrupt imperial medical procedures if they wanted to keep their visas. But the part of him that had sat beside Maya while she shrank under 2 white sheets had already stepped forward. He gestured at the displays. "You keep calling this a genetic collapse," he said, struggling to keep his voice even. "But all these stress markers? They were high before every treatment and worse after. Their immune responses spike every time someone touches them with a needle." "That is the disease mechanism," the physician snapped. "The immune system is attacking their own bodies." "I know," David cut in. "Heard that speech before. Different galaxy, same script. What I don't hear anyone saying is that those spikes also happen whenever you flood them with your meds, take them out of their pods, turn the lights up to interrogation level, and stand over them arguing succession law." One of the advisors hissed, crest flaring defensive red. "You overstep, human." David swallowed. His palms were slick inside his gloves. "I overstepped," he said quietly, "the first time I let a team of experts convince me my kid didn't need to be held because the wires were more important. I'm not making that mistake again." The words hung in the air, translating a fraction of a second later through the palace's linguistic field. Zyrene's head tilted just slightly. Her gaze moved from the displays to his face. For a Valfurin, that was equivalent to grabbing him by the collar. "Explain," she said. David forced himself to walk closer to the dais. The containment field buzzed faintly as he approached, tasting for pathogens, scanning his biosignature. A warning glyph popped up, then dimmed as the system recognized his clearance. "My daughter," he began, then had to stop. The syllables tasted of hospital coffee and cheap sanitizer. "Maya. Terminal neuroimmune disorder. Different physiology, same concept." Her body was attacking itself. The more we treated it, the more confused it got. "She died," Zyrene said matter of fact. "Yes." His throat locked for a beat. "She died." No one in the room flinched. Valfurins did not whisper around death. It was just a data point. "She also," David went on, "spent her last months being poked, scanned, and spoken about instead of spoken to. We were told holding her could dislodge tubes, that our stress might worsen her condition. So we stood back and we watched and we prayed to machines." He nodded at the triplets. "These 3 have never been held outside a calculation, have they? Fed on schedule, touched on schedule, seen on schedule. Now they're dying on schedule. You want something to change? He laid his palm flat against the containment field. Change the schedule. The chamber went very still. That is not how our neurology works, an advisor protested. Bonding carries risk. Over-attunement can. Overload. I read the packet, David said. But what's the prognosis if you do nothing? You already told her. He didn't look at the Empress as he said it. Couldn't. I'm not saying scrap your medicine, he added. I'm saying, stop treating them as a problem to fix and start treating them as children who are scared out of their minds. Turn down the lights. Stop shouting over them. And for the love of every god you've got. He stepped through the containment field as alarms began to bleat in protest. Someone needs to hold them. Hands reached for him too late. David Reeves, who had once watched his daughter die under the weight of other people's expertise, reached into the cradle of alien starlight and did the one thing no one on Valfura had thought to do. He scooped the Emperor's smallest son into his arms. The child was astonishingly light. For a brief, sick instant David thought that meant he was already too far gone, that there was nothing left under the fragile skin and glowing veins. Then the little body shivered against his chest. The alarms squealed louder as med-drones swarmed, then froze midair when Zyrene lifted one hand. Stand down, the Empress said. The command cut through the chamber's rising chaos with surgical precision. Drones halted. Advisors went abruptly silent. Even the chief physician's crest dulled from outrage red to an uneasy gray. David barely heard any of it. He cradled the child closer, one palm supporting the narrow shoulders, the other at the base of the skull. The triplet's crest, far smaller than an adult's, a soft fan of luminous filaments, brushed his neck with a warmth that surprised him. Hey there, he whispered, human vowels warping gently under the translator field. Yeah, I know this is weird. First human cuddle, zero warning. Hang in there, kiddo. The little one's breathing hitched, then slowed. Monitors flickered. Observe the stress registry, one of the younger physicians blurted, unable to help himself. All eyes snapped to the nearest hollow. Cortisol analogs dropping. Neural overdrive indices stabilizing by fraction. The change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a miracle. But it was the first line on any chart that had stopped falling. Zyrene took a single step closer. The movement felt seismic. Her gaze traveled from the readings to David's face and then, slowly as if approaching a dangerous animal, to the small bundle in his arms. What are you doing to him? She asked. David swallowed. Less than every machine in here, he said. And more than anyone has in his short life. He shifted his grip, settling into the familiar rhythm he had learned pacing hospital corridors. Slight bounce, soft sway, repetitive patterns that told a fragile nervous system that the world might still be predictable. He began to hum. The tune was nothing special, an old earth lullaby his grandmother had used, half words, half nonsense syllables. Maya had adored it, insisting it sounded spacey, long before Earth had official contact. His voice wasn't good. It cracked halfway through the first line. But his chest vibrated, and that vibration traveled into the tiny frame pressed against him. The child's crest brightened, filaments pulsing faintly in time with the rhythm. Across the dais, the other two triplets stirred. One made a weak reaching motion, fist closing on empty air. David's throat clenched. Oh, buddy, he murmured. I got you. He glanced at Zyrene. You want to call off the alarm chorus? He said hoarsely. Or should I start singing louder? Because that's a threat I'm willing to escalate. It was a bad joke. An awful time for one. A few of the younger staff made involuntary huffing sounds anyway. Shock did strange things. Zyrene's multifaceted eyes reflected him from a dozen angles. What do you propose, human? She asked. David, he said. His chin jerked toward the remaining cradles. Lower the fields. Let them feel each other. Where I come from, separating siblings in a crisis is considered unwise. That may cause a psychic feedback loop, yeah. Or maybe it causes them to remember they're not alone. He met Zyrene's gaze head-on. They are not equipment. They are babies. The Valfurans had a word that didn't translate perfectly, a term for the uncomfortable emotional static that filled a space when someone said something undeniably true that no one wanted to hear. The chamber hummed with it. Zyrene's crest shifted through a spectrum, colors chasing each other in tight loops. Internal conflict made visible. At last she raised her hand. Again. Lower the fields, she ordered. The chief physician made a strangled noise. My Empress, if their attunement surges. Then we will record the surge and study it, Zyrene said. Or we will perish witnessing something new, which is more than we can say for the last 12 protocols. It was not humor. But a bitter shard of something close to it crept into her voice. The containment fields dimmed. David stepped carefully between the cradles and eased himself down, back braced against the warm crystal of the dais, so that he could rest the small prince partly across his chest and partly overlapping the nearest sibling. Tiny fingers flexed, brushed, found each other. On the monitors, a new line appeared as their neural signatures began to sync. The third child, the one with the violet glow, released a weak, warbling sound. It wasn't a cry. It was closer to a question. "Yeah," David whispered. "He's here. You're all here." He looked absurd, human overalls stained with cleaning solution, boots scuffed, hair askew, sitting cross-legged on a royal cradle platform with two imperial heirs tangling their glowing hands in his shirt. He didn't care. For the first time in years, his body remembered what it was for. Holding. Shielding. Being a reference point in a world gone incomprehensible. Quick pause. Have you ever felt invisible, as if no one really saw you at all? Drop a red heart in the comments if you've been there. And tell us, where on Earth or off it are you watching from right now? We read every single comment and it means more than you know. Hours passed. Not the frantic kind that had ruled the nursery for weeks, full of alarms and shouted orders, but a strange, fragile stillness broken only by soft beeps and quieter voices. The medical staff, once they realized Zyrene was not going to incinerate the human for his audacity, shifted into a different mode. Observe, record, adjust. They dimmed the invasive scanning beams as far as safety allowed. They recalibrated nanotherapies to respond to stress cues instead of ignoring them. One bold researcher suggested synchronizing the mednanites' pulses with David's heartbeat. "That's ridiculous," the chief physician had snorted, right before approving the experiment. Zyrene dismissed all but a skeleton crew and withdrew halfway behind a translucent veil at the chamber's edge. She did not leave. David felt her gaze on him whenever he looked away. He stayed where he was. The triplets clung with surprising strength for beings weighed almost nothing. Little limbs tangled, crest filaments meshing with the seams of his shirt. Every so often, a spark of sensation flickered up his arms. A tingle, a flash of alien scent memory, a shimmer of color behind his eyes. He didn't mention it. He had no baseline for what was normal Valfuran infant behavior, and the last thing anyone needed was more panic. Instead he talked. About nothing. About everything. On Earth, he had learned that silence in hospital rooms could be as heavy as any disease. So he filled the air with his clumsy voice. "Back home we had this park," he told them, words tumbling out slower now, softened by exhaustion. "Little pond, ducks that looked cute and were secretly tiny feathered gangsters. Maya used to chase them with these biodegradable bread pellets. She was very insistent on the biodegradable part." He smiled, a small, crooked thing that felt unusual on his face. "You'd have liked her. She collected facts about space. Drove the nurses crazy quizzing them during rounds. If dark matter doesn't interact with light, how do we know it's there? She'd ask, and they'd pretend their scanners needed cleaning to escape." He swallowed. "She would have loved you three. If she could see you glow." His voice frayed. One of the triplets made a soft sound and pressed a tiny palm flat against his sternum, right over the place where his heart hurt most. He exhaled a shuddering breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for 2 years. Across the chamber, Zyrene listened. Her world had never included ducks or Ohio or biodegradable bread pellets. It had included academies, ritual, the relentless weight of history. She had been raised not by parents but by tutors and advisors who smelled of calculation and ceremonial oils. No one had ever sat on the floor with her and told stories about creatures that stole bread from children. No one had ever been allowed to hold the Empress of Valfura when she cried. She watched this human, this maintenance worker with grief woven into his shoulders, cradle her heirs and speak to them as if they were not symbols, not bargaining chips, but small people who might want to hear about mischievous birds. In the shifting patterns of her crest, an unfamiliar color appeared. Envy. The physicians rotated in shifts, collecting data. The data was clear. Under David's improvised treatment, stress levels dropped. Neural instability eased. Cellular degradation slowed, then plateaued. Once, when he nodded off mid-story and his head tipped to the side, the monitors spiked until his chin jerked back up and he resumed the soft sway. "Correlation," grumbled the chief physician through his teeth, "is not causation. Sometimes," murmured the bold researcher, "it is a very loud hint." Word spread through the palace. By the second day, staff paused more often at the nursery doors. Some peered through the transparent barrier, scales flickering in disbelief at the sight of their empress's heirs curled against a human's chest. Whispers coiled through the corridors. The triplets were stabilizing. Because of medical innovation, some said, desperate to preserve the old narrative. Because of the human, others countered under their breath. Because someone had finally treated them as children. The Imperial Council did not like whispers it hadn't commissioned. By the end of the third day, the triplets were no longer actively dying. They weren't exactly thriving either, but color had returned to their skin. Their crests glowed more steadily. They made soft, questioning sounds that pulled at something primal in everyone who heard them. The medical team, exhilarated and exhausted, refined their protocols to integrate what they had begun to call, in clinical reports, continuous tactile regulation. In informal conversations they called it the human method. David called it parenting. He did not say that part out loud. He rotated out only when his body absolutely insisted, staggering back to the tiny staff quarters assigned to him, stripping off his glitter-smudged gloves with shaking hands, staring at the bunk where he slept alone. Once, fumbling in the half-light, he caught himself reaching automatically for the second bunk, the one he used to tuck Maya into at the hospital accommodations. His hand met empty air. He stood there until the palace's day-night cycle dimmed and brightened again. When he returned to the nursery, he usually found Zyrene already there. She had altered her schedule, an event that sent ripples of confusion through the bureaucracy, which had operated for years on the assumption that the Empress's time blocks were as immutable as celestial mechanics. Now whole segments of policy review went unsigned. Ceremonial appearances were delegated. Trade delegations were kept waiting in antechambers that smelled faintly of disinfectant and unfamiliar human shampoo. Zyrene sat behind her translucent veil, watching. On the fourth day she stepped through it. The staff froze. One drone dropped a tray of instruments with a clatter. David looked up from where he sat, a baby in each arm and the third resting across his lap, clutching the fabric of his overalls with all three tiny hands. The Empress approached until she stood directly beside him. Up close, she radiated a subtle heat, the air around her buzzing faintly with the pressure of her psychic field. Humans usually reacted with awe, nausea, or both. David mostly felt tired. "Your posture is poor," Zyrene observed. "Spent a lot of years on plastic chairs," he said. Ergonomics weren't a priority. His attempt at humor fell flat. The Empress's eyes were on the children. "What does it feel like?" she asked. He blinked. "Holding them?" "Yes." He searched for words. "Heavy and light at the same time," he said slowly. "Warm but also. On my world there's a thing called static electricity. Tiny sparks when you touch someone. It's like that but on the inside." Zyrene's hands were clasped again, knuckles, joint nodes, almost colorless. "We were taught," she said, voice low, "that this kind of contact in early development could bind our minds too tightly. That an empress must be able to stand apart from her heirs, for their safety and for the stability of the line." David's jaw tightened. "We were taught," he answered, "that children in critical care needed to be monitored more than held. That infections were the main danger, not isolation." Both sets of teachers were very sure of themselves. He glanced up at her. "How's that working out for you?" The question hung there, impertinent and honest. Zyrene's crest shifted. Her gaze flicked to the displays, plateaued lines, slow improvements that conventional medicine alone had not achieved. She unclasped her hands. "Show me," she said. David's breath caught. "Are you sure? I mean, I'm barely qualified for this myself and I'm human, which your etiquette manual keeps reminding me is basically a sentient biohazard." Her mouth curved just a fraction. "This empire has survived plagues, wars, and 3 separate invasions by creatures that eat stars," she said. "If my heirs are undone by, what is the term, cooties, then perhaps we do not deserve to rule." One of the younger medtechs choked on a laugh and turned it hastily into a cough. David swallowed a snort of his own. "Right then," he said. "Wash your hands." She stared. "My hands self-sterilized through." "Humor me." He showed her how to run her fingers under the cleansing field, how to rub palm against palm in a rhythm he'd learned singing Happy Birthday, off-key over sink basins. Then he adjusted his hold, shifting one of the triplets, Violet Glow, into the crook of Zyrene's waiting arms. Her posture for a heartbeat went rigid. The baby squirmed, tiny crest brushing against ceremonial fabric. Zyrene inhaled sharply. "What is?" "That's his crest against your suit," David murmured. "He's not breaking. He's trying to burrow." "They do that." The Empress looked down. The small face tipped up toward hers, multifaceted eyes unfocused but undeniably directed at the massive presence that was Mother, though the word had never been spoken aloud in this chamber. The child released a soft, trilling sound. It vibrated straight through Zyrene's bones. On the monitors, all 3 neural signatures surged, not chaotically but in a pattern that had never appeared before. Resonance. Their attunement is, a physician gasped, scrambling for a better adjective, harmonizing. Zyrene barely heard. The color patterns rippling across her crest had no name in Valforan lexicon. Something between terror and awe and the disorienting relief of finally touching a part of oneself walled off for too long. Her arms unconsciously tightened. The child settled. For the first time since their birth, the imperial heirs were held by their mother. The next days changed everything. Zyrene began to spend hours in the nursery, cradling one child at a time, then 2, then gingerly attempting all 3 with David's guidance. She learned to sway. She learned to hum Valforan tonal patterns threading oddly with David's earth melody until the medtech started recording them, convinced there was something mathematically significant in the blend. Under her touch, the triplets' recovery accelerated. Cell regeneration metrics ticked up. Autoimmune markers retreated. Their crests flashed not only in pain and fear, but in what the researchers tentatively labeled curiosity. It should have been a triumph that united the empire. Instead, it scared the people who preferred their rulers untouchable. Whispers in the corridors thickened. Some advisors spoke of dangerous human influence, of emotional contamination. There was talk of precedent, of what might happen if common citizens started expecting their leaders to hold them, metaphorically or otherwise. On the 7th day, David arrived at the nursery to find the doors sealed and flanked by 2 members of the Imperial Guard whose armor glowed with the dull authority of not your pay grade. David said. Did the kids develop fangs overnight? You are summoned, one guard intoned, to the High Council chamber. That sounds friendly, David muttered. It was not. The High Council chamber was a circle of tiered seats under a dome that displayed the stars above Valfura in real time. A reminder that all of this beautiful drama was happening on a fragile rock in infinite space. David stood in the center, feeling very much like a stain someone had forgotten to scrub out of the floor. Above him, counselors arranged themselves in vectors of color and status. Zyrene occupied the highest seat, alone on her platform, crest dimmed to a neutral pattern that meant nothing and everything. David Reeves of Terra, boomed the Chancellor, a Valforan with a voice like grinding glass, you have interfered in imperial medical protocols without authorization. David lifted his chin. With results your own reports call unprecedented positive response. You're welcome. A rustle of disapproval answered. You have also, the Chancellor went on, a history. A hollow flared to life beside David, projected from hidden nodes. He flinched. On the giant display hovered images he had hoped never to see again. His own face ravaged and unshaven, arguing with a panel of human doctors, forms he'd signed, medical protocols stamped with corporate logos, Maya's chart. I don't see how. You authorized experimental treatments on your offspring, the Chancellor said, pouncing on the word. Therapies not cleared for her age group. At least one resulted in multi-organ failure. David's stomach lurched. I authorized trials because every approved option had already failed, he said hoarsely. I was trying to give her some chance instead of none. Your personal justification is irrelevant, another counselor snapped. The fact remains, your decisions coincided with the decline and death of your child. It was a weaponized version of a thought David had whispered to himself in 3 a.m. fugue states for years. It still hit. He swayed. High above, Zyrene's hands were hidden in her sleeves again. Her crest had gone dangerously still. The Imperial heirs, the Chancellor said, are not test subjects for a grieving human to assuage his guilt. The Council invokes the right of validation. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Even David, who had skimmed the thinner sections of Valforan law out of boredom, knew that term. An ancient right, rarely used, requiring any outsider who influenced the royal line to prove their fitness, through what the translation field rendered as knowledge, wisdom, and legacy. It was not an exam. It was a trial. You will stand before this council, the Chancellor declared, and justify not only your methods, but your existence in proximity to the heirs. Fail and you will be removed. Permanently. They didn't specify whether removed meant from the palace, the planet, or the plane of existence. The omission felt deliberate. If that twist just punched you right in the heart, tap that like button thumbs up. It helps more than you know. And stay with us because the most emotional moment is still on its way. Before David could answer, another hollow sprang up, this one at Zyrene's gesture. My counselors are not the only ones with history, she said quietly. The dome dimmed. New images filled the air, grainy footage from a human hospital recorded by a camera that should not have been there. A hallway outside a pediatric ward. A much younger David asleep in a chair, Maya curled against his chest, tubes and all, as he hummed off-key. Valforan script scrolled at the top. Unauthorized observation log. David stared, throat closing. What is this? He whispered. Zyrene looked down at him across the gulf. I was there when your daughter died, she said. Gasp. Even among a species that hated melodrama, the bluntness sliced the room. I watched, Zyrene continued, voice steady but no longer neutral, through forbidden channels because our scouts had reported a human child with an immune disorder that mirrored the weakness in our own genome. We sought data. We found you. Her crest flickered, old shame long buried. You refused to let your child become a data point, she said. You held her when your physicians told you not to. You sang. You chose comfort over clinical distance in her final hours. She rose from her seat. I have been searching for you since that day. The chamber reeled around David. His grief. Her heirs. Their crisis. All of it, suddenly, threaded together through a history he hadn't known existed. The council had summoned him for judgment. The Empress had summoned him for something far more dangerous. Hope. The rite of validation convened at dawn. David stood once more in the council circle, but this time the triplets were there too, hover cradles arranged in a triangle around him, their soft glow bathing his boots in shifting color. Zyrene descended from her platform to stand at his side. The Chancellor sputtered. My Empress, tradition. Tradition, she said, is why our heirs were dying in the first place. Today we test something else. The trial began. They questioned his knowledge first. Valforan history. Human history. Cross-species law. David fielded what he could remember from briefings and late-night reading, openly admitted what he didn't know and, more than once, said, I don't have that answer, but here's the question I'd start with. The scribes, and used to humility in that chamber, struggled to categorize those responses. Then came wisdom. What is sovereignty? A counselor demanded. Being responsible for people you may never meet, David answered. And not treating their lives as numbers you can rearrange without cost. What is medicine? Another pressed. An agreement, he said tiredly, between fear and hope. What is failure? The Chancellor hissed. He flinched. Silence stretched. Finally, David lifted his head. Failure, he said, voice rough, is when pain doesn't teach us anything. My daughter died. That will always be a failure in my bones. If I let that turn me into someone who left these children to face the same cold, that would be unforgivable. So I came into that nursery. I held them. Not to erase what I did wrong, but to refuse to waste what she taught me. The word legacy translated next. On Valfura, it usually meant bloodlines, monuments, recorded deeds. David glanced at the triplets. Maya's gone, he said quietly. She won't have statues. There's no star named after her. But every time I choose to be the father she deserved, even for someone else's kids, she's still changing the world. That's my legacy. That's hers. One of the triplets reached out, tiny hands smacking clumsily against the field between them. Monitors chimed. For the first time they spoke, or rather, their nascent psychic field pulsed in a crude shared concept that even the translators struggled to render. The chamber's nodes projected a single, halting word into every mind present. Father. Valforan advisors, battle-hardened and cynical, flinched as if struck. Zyrene's eyes closed briefly, then opened shining. The heirs have validated him, she said, crest blazing with colors no one could misread. Formalities crumbled. The Chancellor tried, weakly, to raise procedural objections, but the room had shifted under his claws. Physicians who had watched numbers change under David's hands spoke up. Young staff who'd seen the Empress learning to hold her children added their voices. Change, once unthinkable, suddenly felt inevitable. In light of the evidence, Zyrene declared, this council will recognize David Reeves of Terra as guardian consultant to the Imperial heirs and director of interspecies nurturing sciences. Mouths fell open at the invented title. As of this moment, she continued, no child on Valfura, royal or otherwise, will be denied physical comfort on the altar of protocol. We will rewrite our caregiving codes. And we will invite other species who understand what we have forgotten to help us learn. She turned, meeting David's stunned gaze. You are not invisible here, she said softly. My heirs know you. I know you. Your child's love stands in this chamber through you. David's vision blurred. He went to one knee, Not because protocol demanded it but because his legs gave out under the weight of finally being seen. 1 year later the citadel sounded different. Children's laughter echoed in halls that had never heard it before. Cradles no longer hovered alone. They were surrounded by parents, siblings, caregivers from a dozen worlds. The old nursery had been transformed into the center for shared growth, its walls lined with art made by very small, very sticky hands. A human-style rocking chair sat proudly in the corner, one of many concessions the architects had made, secretly delighted by the challenge. David Reeves, wearing formal robes over his still-scuffed boots, walked slowly along a balcony watching a class in session below. Valfurin, Human and other younglings clustered around Empress Zyrene as she demonstrated how to read emotional colors in one another's crests, feathers, skin. Her own heirs clambered over her without a trace of ceremony, tugging at her sleeves, braiding her crest filaments together. She laughed, a sound that had once stunned an entire court into silence, now common enough that staff smiled at it from down the corridor. Papa David. 3 voices, overlapping, rang up from the playmat. Tiny hands waved. One of the triplets nearly toppled over in his excitement, caught at the last second by a medtech who had long since stopped flinching at hugs. David leaned on the railing, heart doing that heavy light thing again. He would always carry loss. But it no longer defined the whole of him. Maya's glitter still stained the back of his glove. It never would come off. He was fine with that. Because on a world that had once treated children as fragile symbols, a stubborn human janitor had tracked hospital footsteps across the stars and left a different mark entirely. And that is how one single father's refusal to look away changed an empire, and 2 species, forever. Now we'd love to hear from you. Which moment in this story reached you the most? Have you ever been someone's unexpected hero, or had one turn up for you? What kind of alien culture should we visit in the next tale? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one and reply to as many as we can. If this story moved you, please tap that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that they matter. And don't go anywhere, we've picked more powerful stories for you on the end screen. Click one and keep the emotions flowing. Remember, in a universe full of countless stars, sometimes all it takes is one person who truly sees you. Until next time, keep believing in the power of compassion. This is Black Horizon HFY, where humanity's greatest strength is its heart. Red Heart.